Welcome back to the Better Living Interest channel, where we break down the blueprint to build better lives, stronger communities, and generational wealth through real estate, economic development, and powerful storytelling. Today's guest is a multi-hyphenate change agent with a mission to connect people, places, and purpose.
Yeah.
She is a real estate strategist, CDFI advocate, emergency management thinker, and an international bridge builder with a heart for community transformation. As she puts it, she may have girl bossed a bit too hard, but that drive has led her to operate at one of the most impactful intersections in modern development: CDFIs, plus real estate, plus private equity, plus emergency management, plus Middle East relations. Guided by her ikigai, a Japanese philosophy of purpose, Peyton has made it her mission to be a connector of people, ideas, and opportunities. She's at the helm of 4 powerful ventures: bridging communities, creating access pipelines and career development, business strategy and recruitment, key to the city media, elevating untold grassroots stories about art, advocacy, and community media, EMHS plus real estate finance, build resilient financial systems that center the most vulnerable, and lastly, open access fellowship, expanding job pipelines for emerging professionals and ensuring early career talents get the mentorship and funding they need to grow. She's not just planning for the future, she is shifting the system today. So thank you, Payton Parkin, for joining us today on the channel.
Yes, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're going to be talking a lot about what you do, your career, what drives your career, your storytelling, your strategy, social justice, and community development, and why she believes the next decade will belong to who dare to be interdisciplinary. So if you're interested, stay tuned, like this video, subscribe to the Better Living Interest channel, and drop a comment sharing the one question you'll ask Peyton if you had coffee with her today. So first, we want to open it up with learning more about you. What first inspired you to pursue a career at the intersection of community development, real estate, and emergency management?
Yeah,
Was there a mentor or moment that shifted your path?
yeah, definitely career pivots. The age of 15, I decided that I wanted to work for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and I knew at that age that I had to be the most competitive person ever, really the top 1% of the top 1% of applicants. So going into Florida State University, my undergrad, alma mater, I actually went in for criminology, then switched over to Middle Eastern studies and Arabic. And part of that was also pursuing a minor in public administration, where I studied U.S. intelligence studies, homeland security, and and emergency management. And the summer I was supposed to travel abroad to Lebanon or Jordan for my Arabic immersive experience was summer 2020. So plans derailed and I had to pivot, obviously, because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions. So I really honed in more on emergency management. And that's where I interned at the Florida Division of Emergency Management in individual assistance, and then worked on along the 4 sectors of emergency management as an intern at Hagerty Consulting, and then transitioned into a full-time position. And I worked on a number of housing, disaster, post-disaster housing recovery projects, from COVID rental assistance to Hurricane Michael Rehouse Bay with Bay County. So that's really what started that merge, where I realized that emergency management and post-disaster housing, they're one and the same. And then even more so when you look at small business being the cornerstone of post-disaster recovery. So that covers commercial real estate, of course. So it wasn't an explicit connection. It was one that I made myself. And then, of course, once I expressed that to my mentors, they saw worth in me pursuing my master's program at Georgetown, which is the Master's of Science in Global Real Assets. So yeah, that's really what started it all.
Nice. And with many of your reflections that we got to research and see, it ties back to faith, resilience, and community. How do those influences guide the way you approach your work today? Because that's some heavy work.
Yeah, it is. It is. As you were giving the introduction, I was just like, this is the most ADHD thing ever, which is also something I discovered this year where I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I have no problem being transparent about that because I definitely see it as a blessing once I develop systems that work around it. And I think that allows me to handle the number of connections and intersections and such. And I really have nothing but God to give thanks for, especially in the past 3 months. I was unfortunately one of the 300,000 Black women who were released from the workforce. I worked for a federal contractor earlier this year, and I definitely recognize my privilege in seeing that this was more of a sabbatical for me, or to really grow closer to Christ and lean on my community a lot. I've been a bit hyper independent for most of my adult years. So having to be put in the position to really humble myself more and ask for help in ways that I've never really asked for help before is definitely something that I believe it's a lessons from God. And there are two main verses that really hold close to my heart. Is definitely Psalms 34:18 that talks about the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. So of course, when you're released from a position, it is an unfortunate reality, but I definitely believe that between growing closer to him and him sending very much Christ-centered people to my life, helped me do the work. And that leads into the other verse. Psalms 90:17 speaks about asking God to bless my hands as I do his work. So definitely drawing closer to my purpose and seeing the intersections more is definitely something that I have no one but God to thank for that. And yeah, that's very important to me.
Amen. Yeah, definitely. You got to have, I would say, a spiritual connection when you're
Yeah.
doing heavy work like
Yeah.
this. You know, it's a great responsibility and it can weigh heavy on your heart and mind when you're trying to help underserved communities rise and build generational
Yeah.
wealth. This is good to have that for you, for sure, that connection. And it shows, it reflects because you're doing some amazing work. Speaking of the amazing work that you're doing, looking back at your emergency management experiences, what lessons have you carried forward into real estate and infrastructure work with that?
Yeah, it's definitely the importance of preparedness and mitigation. In emergency management, there are four main phases: preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery. Response being what everyone sees. My former mentor would say, saving the kittens from the trees, but literally saving people from trees, rooftops, when their house has been flooded and they had to flee to the roof of their homes. Those continuity plans, business plans, risk mitigation, and planning for the worst, and seeing how that intersects in the community in terms of financial stability and community recovery. And with mitigation, that's what we see a lot with the resilience. So the retrofitting, how do we fortify our assets? And it's interesting that I say assets because this is not how it's said in the emergency management world, but being more on the real assets, real estate side, that's exactly what we're doing. That's really how a lot of things come together in those epiphanies where we're doing a lot of the same things. And recovery is the longest and the most expensive. That's the replanning of cities after places have been leveled. That's trying to keep the small businesses that were decimated by whatever natural or man-made disaster. So that takes really exercising the plan that was written in the preparedness phase. And not everything goes as planned. It's the same way, especially when there are other factors involved, such as public-private partnerships, interest rates, supply chain, a lot of these things that we're seeing right now that are being affected on a macro and federal level.
Yeah, 100%. I firmly believe that when you make plans, God
No,
laughs at you.
trust me, I know.
So
You know.
I know when you're trying to do real estate, everything is predicated on your planning. So the better you plan, the better the deals, the better the projects, the more sound the properties
Yeah.
are, the long lasting, the longevity. But, you know, there are still so many other factors that we can't control, right? Like, let's not forget we just went through a global
Yeah.
pandemic and nobody foresaw that. So it's very real. Speaking about public-private partnerships, the P3s, how often do you tout them as solutions for infrastructure gaps? From your experience, what makes a P3 successful and what risks should communities be mindful of?
So with that, quite honestly, I remember going to my grad program and there was this one class called the built back transportation in the built environment. And it was the first class that spoke about P3. And I didn't know about P3 explicitly by term through emergency management. It's something I discovered through just researching like different programs and such. And throughout my grad program, I realized how much that's really, of course, what really solidified the connection between emergency management and real estate. Because what comes first is public funding. But when we look at post disaster recovery, we look at FEMA. What does that financial deployment look like? And also other post disaster, even the pandemic really threw people for a loop who had been in emergency management for some time because they hadn't lived through a pandemic before. So framing a pandemic as a disaster as well. And we look at the American Rescue Plan Act and the CARES Act that responded to that disaster. And it's solidified that public funding comes first. And then that sets the foundation of, okay, infrastructure, investment, public finance, and that sets the foundation for private equity to do what needs to be done. And what I see, especially now with what's happening with the federal government, is that when you pull that public funding, you're putting a lot of reliance on the private funding that the private equity side does not really see how much public funded is needed. I see that there's a bit of a divide. I believe that like municipalities especially, need to really be more intentional about bringing those like public funding stakeholders and private funding stakeholders explicitly to the table, as opposed to, okay, this is just one step after the other. I think now moving forward is being more intentional about, okay, if you want to bringing BlackRock and a big private equity firm that's very involved in a number of businesses, but especially like housing, real estate, what does that look like post-disaster and how much does that rely on public funding? And it's a bit of a sticky situation now with how FEMA is because people don't know what's going to happen. We saw what happened with Asheville and even a couple of weeks ago where the federal government was putting like terms on politicized terms and stipulations and conditions on public funding, which is something that's meant to be apolitical because red, blue, black, white, rural, inner city, anything like that, it all depends on public funding. So I think moving forward is being more intentional about bringing those stakeholders to the table and like being more intentional about the preparedness. And what I see now is more, and I don't think it's by accident, quite frankly, more weight and discretion placed on private equity, private funding. And I think people are going to realize how much public funding is needed. Yeah. And it seems obvious, right? But as I went through my grad program, which is very much a traditional real estate, I didn't learn about CDFIs until later on after my program or close to the end and not tied explicitly to my program. And whenever I'd bring out anything about public funding, it was definitely something that was not well known about. And I think that's the issue. It's just the lack of openness and information about public funding and how much is needed in recovery at all.
Yeah. I did my master's program and my project was on public-private
Mm-hmm.
partnerships. And I think this was back in 2016. Even then, we started to study and research that there was a trend of government
Mm-hmm.
relinquishing a lot of their responsibility going into private
Yeah.
sectors to provide services that typically your government was known for doing. Definitely could say that with this administration, there's a huge push
Yeah.
for public private partnerships and more emphasis on the private side of
Yeah.
it as well. So, yeah, that all lines. And it's an ebb and flow,
Exactly.
right? Because when it goes up, it'll come back down and then it'll switch around and go back the opposite way or go left, it'll go right. So, I think to your point, it's really about making sure that you're building something that's impactful and that is going to have long term
Right.
stability.
You look at what's the end goal? What's supposed to be the focus of the public versus private? Typically, the public, municipalities, federal, state, local, all levels of government focused on the people and their interests and the constituents. However, with the private side, it's their fiduciary responsibilities, their stakeholders, their stockholders, and ROI. So when there is a separation of the two, or one is too heavily weighted on the other, and what's happening right now, it's the pushing for public services to be privatized, and public service such as post-disaster recovery being privatized. That is something I don't anticipate going well, quite frankly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's alarming. Speaking of, in your studies of Nordic infrastructure financing models, pretty
Yeah.
cool. What best practices could realistically be adapted to the US? And could you explain what that is as well for our
Yeah.
audience?
So last year for my global business experience, my GBE with Georgetown, my cohort and I traveled to Sweden and we studied their sustainable infrastructure and really seeing how intentional they are with their planning and financing in the sense of focusing much on being people centered and sustainable focused. My program did have an ESG proponent to it, environmental social governance. So, as with the EU, they are a bit more strict about how things are normalized in the United States. They're strict over there about that. For example, our food, like high fructose corn syrup and red 40, that's very much common in our food. It's something that is not. That's very much limited in their food. So in the sense of infrastructure and when we're looking at housing, I remember that we were based in Stockholm and along, I forgot the name of the body of water that runs through the city, but the city had like trailer, like shipping containers, and that was for housing. And it just really made me think, wow, if it really brought back to the theme of if they wanted to, they would. I know people typically say that in the context of dating, but truly in the context of and truly, in the context of infrastructure planning and municipalities and the role of being more people centered, that's part of it. And then, of course, having private investments into that, it's ingrained into the fabric of the culture. And speaking of culture, and I know we're talking about financing, who are the ones creating these financing models? In the United States, very much individualized, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But one of the talking points from the speakers from a company, a Nordic company, was that culture of the Nordics, it's very like community centered and holistic centered and seeing themselves in someone who is without a home, without a house, right? And how do we solve that? In the United States, and I quite honestly get frustrated with it, when we're thinking about social infrastructure, such as housing, it's seen as a character flaw and it's seen as a blight on the community and not doing much to truly solve it. So, for example, like going back to the shipping containers, if you don't want to see homeless people on the streets, then what is the solution for that? And I know most people say, oh, just public house, like shelters and such. And this is where a lot of P3 could come in too, right? Where if you put so much weight on the public to solve much of the social issues such as homelessness, and not bring in private investments and make it part of the model to have, that is an issue. And I think a lot of the issues that we see that it could be solved by intentional private public-private partnerships. P3. I'm just going to say P3 from now on. There we go. So yeah, we're focusing on like long-term infrastructure planning and the emphasis on sustainability, looking at carbon emissions, looking at the supply chain. Those are very much ingrained into the overall structure of the Nordics and the EU that the United States does not have. And we see in the United States where there's a lot of like strong lobbying from companies that are not so focused on sustainability. And sustainability is more than just the climate, it's also human sustainability as well. That's definitely some revelations I experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, the people when born in America, raised in America, and they get the opportunity to go live in other first world countries, even emerging world countries as well, they get to see how the culture and the values are viewed very
Yeah.
differently. And not only are their cultures and values viewed differently, but also their infrastructure is built, I personally would say, in a more holistic, better framework.
Exactly.
Time is going to tell what's going to happen here. But yeah, that's why we got leaders like yourself, pushing some new innovations and things and bringing back all those good resources to further assist and help in development and in policy
Yeah,
creation. They go hand in
they do.
hand. Speaking of foresight and putting things together with best practices, how do you see the future of affordable housing investment evolving, especially with the push for sustainability and climate resistant infrastructure?
Yeah, it's going back to that and mindset shift, quite frankly, because as you've probably seen, you've been in this industry a lot longer than I have, is that how people speak about affordable housing. They typically see like the 1970s, 1980s, like public housing that's like just an eyesore in a community, and that's gave birth to NIMBYism and such. And, just seeing, I think a lot of real estate needs to take a step back and realize that they're more than just assets, they're for people. And that was part of my application response for my program, was that when you look at real estate and then you get caught up in the spreadsheets and the numbers and the 3% rent growth every year, it's who is this affecting? And the mindset shift is having to go back to the community, go back to people. It's interesting. I recently read an article by CNBC. It was actually an article and a video, and the CEO, Jonathan Rose, he said that with the One Big Beautiful Act, affordable housing is now profitable. And I'm just like, it's good to know that you think that now, because affordable housing has been dehumanized a lot. And that is the issue, quite frankly, that people in traditional real estate are not remembering that there are people in those assets, in those mixed use or multifamily assets. And when it's said that, oh, it's profitable now because of the expansion of light tech and the permanence of new markets and other community development finance tools and now it's profitable. It's just very much spreadsheets, underwriting, bottom line centered, as opposed to seeing it as, okay, there's more opportunity for people to get affordable housing. This is an opportunity to solve the affordable housing crisis. Something that, as I said before, a lot of people complain about seeing homeless people, but not do much about it and not advocate for it and a solution. So what needs to shift is really, I think, a lot of the mindsets of the people who are doing the work, the mindsets of the decision makers, the mindsets of the developers, the investors, deconstruct how they view people who are suffering from poverty and what other factors go into that. Yes, you may look at the housing as one thing, but when you look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs, that's something that I really keep close, because to get to one level after the other, you have to achieve the previous one. And the basic needs, food, housing, water, security, if you can't achieve that, then you end up with people who are just living in slums or public housing forever. Are you addressing your education needs? What about food scarcity? What about transportation? Public transportation specifically. I believe the biggest issue is looking at these things in silos as opposed to a more supportive housing model. So I think that needs to be more common in how we elevate people and really focus on those hierarchy of needs to even achieve self-actualization, so people can like cycle out and graduate out of affordable housing or Section 8 or LIHTC sponsored or subsidized assets. So yeah, I think that's the number one. That has to change, because a lot of people have to unwork and unpack a lot of biases in order to do their work. And that's why I pray Psalms 90:17 is just to humble myself as I do my work and think about others, think about how it affects me and seeing how much it's affecting other people, the end users.
Yes, that's very real. And because you're speaking and you're being conscious of the end users, the everyday people, the most underserved, the most vulnerable, what bold incentives would you propose to local governments to help empower those individuals and those groups to build wealth creation?
I had some thoughts about that. As for incentives, my response has changed with seeing how much what's happening on like all levels of government and how that's actualizing at this point. I don't want to make it so dark, quite honestly, but I think it's a lot bigger than this, because going back to what I said with the issue of this individualistic versus communal style of culture and how that leads to success of any sort of project or company or anything like that. And yeah, it's a convergence of that and like the mindset shift, quite honestly. And of course, it's going to take, people are going to look at the numbers. It's always going to be the numbers. We're in a capitalistic, corporate focused society. And a lot of what we're seeing right now is, oh, we never had money to do that before. There was no like incentive to do that before. And then we see how our federal money, our federal funding is being used right now, right? Where we see the shift of mitigation dollars, for example, on shifting that to ICE raids, $200 million earmarked for a ballroom. And some people have to really step back. And I think that's exactly what's happening, where people are seeing the shift of where is my taxpayer money going? And the excuse of needing an incentive to do something that will help a community, I think it's something that we have to let go of. Yeah, it's definitely something that we have to let go of, because at this point, look how our federal funding is being used. what was it, like 250 or $450 million of FEMA funding used to build and operate Alligator Alcatraz. And that could have been used more productively for the affordable housing crisis, to build more shelters, systems, more than just building more shelters, right? It's a lot more than that. It's building systems that will sustain the test of time and the test of unique circumstances that a number of homeless people will face. How are you truly addressing drug use, mental health issues, and going into the other parts that I mentioned earlier? And say this quote again, if they wanted to, they would, because clearly every day this administration is showing how much they don't value the American people, and the conversation of what is the incentive for building affordable housing? What's the incentive for placing more grocery stores, healthy grocery stores into low income neighborhoods, right? Because those incentives exist, those conversations exist, and far too often they're slapped down, and some of them are actually like actionable, and they get talked down, historically have been pushed aside. But our taxpayer money, it's really dissecting that and looking into that and calling for an audit of how can people put their money in what they value the most. And with especially local government and state government, more people being more involved politically and holding their representatives accountable. Um, and it's going to be that the incentive for them to keep their position as a representative in Congress on the federal level, the governor state level or the mayor local level, is holding them accountable, holding our elected officials accountable, and being more pointed into what our taxpayer money is going to. That's the incentive for them. If you really want your position, are you listening to your constituents? And I'm seeing a number of elected officials in several states that are dismissing their constituents at town halls. And the people who will show up set the time aside to go to town halls are the ones who are definitely voting and like politically involved. So even in red states, we're seeing that shift. And I think it's about time. So the incentive, I believe it has to be focused on less of, oh, if you build an affordable housing project, there's this certain level subsidized percentage on something else or tax credits or anything that I think the incentive has to be like actionable accountability at all levels. And that's really the power of the public sector, because the public sector has the will and the power to determine how and where private funding is spent. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
I know it's
I
like a
hear you.
long-winded way of saying things.
But yeah, it's true. A lot of it is having the right people with, and when I say right people, having people with the right
Yeah.
intentions and can carry things forward that are going to make sure that they're considering all of those and really help uplifting instead of just overlooking the most vulnerable
Yes.
communities
Yes.
is really going to help move this forward. So appreciate that insight. And speaking of, you had some time servicing as a policy and research fellow at the African American Alliance of CDFI CEO. How did you use the CDFIs tackling systemic inequities in housing, business ownership, and community wealth building?
Yeah. My time at the Alliance was definitely transformational, because not only was I exposed to the CDFI world for the first time, um, through the Open Access Fellowship, the fellowship that I'm on the board of, it was interesting being introduced to the CDFI space and then being placed at the Alliance, it showed me there's still a divide between Black-led CDFIs and white-led CDFIs, where the racial disparities that you see is certainly, it's still clear in the CDFI industry. And that's something I had to learn, that, it says community development finance, and there's still that racial divide. And I appreciate when we're talking about tackling the systemic inequities, it's looking at that. And the research that the Alliance has done is important when you look at not only housing, for example, if someone wins a 4% or 9% allocation for light tech or new markets, we all know that the census tracks low income. That's true. And that's great if someone wins. But if it's shifted mostly towards white, rural, white, majority white areas versus minority of Black, specifically Black areas, then we're not really addressing a deep-rooted history of racism in the country. And we saw this when the CDFI fund was being attacked. And one of the case studies, or one of the talking points that really pushed to the eventual permanence of and the expansion of community development finance tools, is that it helps rural communities too. It helps red states too. It helps white majority areas too. And it seems we needed that argument that, oh, it helps white people too, for it to get to where it is now, for people to actually take it seriously. And imagine if it was truly just, yeah, it only helps if, no, not saying this, but if it only helps Black or minority and Latinx communities, then it would not be worthy to protect these tools, these financial tools. The Alliance definitely exposed me to that early on. And it was only a year ago that I learned about CDFIs. It's crazy to think about. And I've just been like full-fledged. This is what I wanted, because I said that my program was ESG focused, but it was not to the level of what CDFIs, the community development finance industry, and especially merging that with climate justice, which is something that the Alliance is a big proponent of. It was the level that I needed, that push that I needed. So yeah, it was definitely eye-opening learning that for the first time, and then seeing what that looks like this year with the federal dismantlement and the attack on the CDFI fund and the minority business and such. So yeah, I think it's just having more of those hard conversations within the industry for sure. Yes, the CDFI industry, that feel-good finance, but there's still that disparity for sure. And CDFIs are meant to bridge the gaps that banks will not do. And of course, providing like anti-displacement capital and like empowering community ownership and such in census-tracked low-income communities. However, it's definitely something that when you look at when it's a Black neighborhood, what does that look like? What does that win look like? How much allocation? The disproportionate difference between the two.
I've had some time and experience working at CDFIs and building CDFIs in my work career. So I really do appreciate CDFIs. I appreciate the U.S. Treasury Department
Yeah.
for providing those funds at low interest rates to help and giving these organizations a mission, aligning with their
Okay.
mission to help financially empower underserved communities. As a real estate developer, that is a really good avenue for emerging developers to go to, is a CDFI,
Mhm.
and also partnering with the larger institution to help make that real lasting impact work.
Yeah.
I want to speak a little bit more global. with you, because I know you have a world view. What role do you see as the intersection between real estate development, displacement, and human rights?
Yeah. I mean, everything. I've always been, look at what's happening in Palestine specifically, and the United States government, Trump, and the prime minister of Israel, and seeing their vision for Palestine. Something that reminds me, it's not to the same scale, please. I'm aware of that. It's not to the same scale, but when we look at, there's parallels between that and the gentrification and displacement issue we see in the United States. And I think wealthy investors, developers come in without a community development focus, and they see opportunity in an area, and we have revitalized that area, right? Revitalize that area, but at the expense of native populations, native community members who suddenly cannot afford to live there due to rent hikes, property taxes, whatever it may be. And when we see the mass displacement as a result of war and genocide, um, that is the human rights issue. And ultimately, where are these people going? Like, there are talks about sending Palestinians, the relatively few who are left there, to countries in Africa, sending them to other Arab nations. And it's interesting how everything this comes together now with my background and seeing and applying the correct terms to what's happening. The human rights perspective is similar to what I've seen in terms of the focus of, you know, CDFIs, a focus of this industry that is people centered. And of course, definitely focus on the bottom line, the numbers, ROI, but it's not always that, right? It's meeting with the community members, meeting with the key stakeholders that are outside of the boardroom. That real estate development, it's going back to what I said about real estate, real assets being ultimately for the people, it should be, who are we catering these projects, who are we catering this to? And I know that the CDFI, it's not something that could easily be copied and pasted abroad in a place like Palestine, right? But how do we get in the rooms of, we fight so hard against displacement in the United States, and it's devastating, but look at what's happening globally. Once I got into real estate, and then through emergency management, and then of course through my grad program, and then learning about CDFIs, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I could just double down, advance in my career and do good work here, and then use whatever lessons here, benchmark, and apply that to what that may look like in the Middle East, like 20 years from now or something. But I'm seeing that it's a bit more urgent and accelerated now, considering the priorities of the President of the United States and the allegiance or alliance with Israel. So I'm still at the beginning phases of seeing, okay, what organizations, international organizations or national organizations, are focused on advocating, lobbying, and doing the work that needs to be done to ensure that the mass displacement, the human rights issues that we see globally, it's not something that will continue. And bringing that CDFI perspective, that passion and the policy and then the finance perspective, how could we apply that to the Middle East? I'm not quite sure of the ins and outs. These revelations, and going back to what I said about faith in God, these revelations are a few months old, some of them a few weeks old. So definitely in the very beginning, but I'm just like, why not? I definitely am the type of person to have the perspective of why not? Because we're seeing right now with the federal government and what they're doing in terms of immigration and just other atrocities, of course, but especially that and its intentions globally, they have that same question. Why not? Even if it's illegal and unconstitutional, why not? So on the other end, the good side per se, that same perspective of being open to innovation and seeing the intersections, parallels that were not as clear previously, but something has to happen.
I agree. We need to do some changes for sure to uplift everyone, not just some.
Yeah.
And within, you also spoke about immigrant and refugee communities. How can real estate development and community investment serve those groups in ways that build both inclusion, resilience, and I would also add to the larger institutions and developers, the ROI, right?
Mhm.
There's a cost benefit too for having these groups being included.
Yeah. And not to simplify someone's, such as immigrant, I know a lot of the conversation about immigrants and what they do for the US economy, in addition to paying taxes and not just it's specified undocumented immigrants, because that's really who's being attacked by this current immigration policy and execution, is that when we look at specifically in real estate development, how crucial undocumented immigrants have been to supporting the hotel industry, the lodging industry, the restaurant industry, all relevant to real estate, all relevant to housing and commercial real estate. And it's what we're seeing, or when we're going to see this shift. And we see it right now, especially in Florida, where projects are taking longer. That coupled with the supply chain issues and the tariffs and these artificial conditions created by the federal government, it's taking a step back and realizing how much people, how everyone has a part to play. And I believe that there has to be stronger advocacy from like real estate and lobbying from real estate developers who rely on undocumented immigrant labor. And here's the thing, your employees, whether or not they're paid under the table or by 1099 or W-2, they should not still be undocumented working for you. And this goes into the needed shift in immigration policy. And I believe that the administration, the federal administration, has really highlighted, they really just wanted to kick people out and think they could just do that, no problem. There are different parts to play, and it's definitely like relevant to what we see moving forward, because without that core base of workers, our economy is going to get worse, a lot worse. And in order to have that appeal to come back, I don't even know. I quite honestly, there's so many factors and key stakeholders in the conversation about immigration, and then adding to how relevant that is to real estate. It's how do we actually move forward to ensure that there's a protection of worker labor rights? And I've always said that what happens to the least protected ones in the nation, we've seen this with Black people, is what they're preparing for the masses, right? And what we see right now with immigration and real estate development is seeing how needed that it all is, right? Because real estate is a core part of like critical infrastructure, for example. And who are the ones building these things? And if you remove that labor base, what is going to happen to the US economy and the US like fabric? So yeah, there's definitely a lot of accountability that needs to be done from like the perspective of real estate development and immigration policy. And not to say that every, real estate developer uses undocumented labor, but it's definitely enough for us to notice that there is a huge shift. So yeah, it has to be some sort of like sponsorship and advocacy and lobbying. But when we look at overall the traditional real estate developers, there's some of them that are like Trump, and that's just how it is.
Understood. Heard you. Gotta be a balance. You can't have the good without the bad. You gotta support those that are doing the work
Yeah.
and supporting you and helping you make those returns. And that's a old, dilemma that we've seen. I think there's been documentaries on how they had sometimes employees or undocumented immigrants. Then the federal government will send an agency. The agency will shut that company or shut that site down. All those employees will leave. And then 2 weeks later, they will come right back. So, at that point, is it really the undocumented workers or is it the organization or is it both? And then if we know that there's a demand for that and the economy is based on that for cheaper goods,
Right.
for cheaper labor costs, then maybe we should do something that's more proactive instead of reactive
Exactly.
and something that's more restorative instead of something that's more punitive.
Right. And then you mentioned ROI when we're just so used to specifically developers that use undocumented immigrants and not sponsor their protection or anything like that. It's just like you're used to not paying that much. You don't have to worry about paying their insurance or other benefits that documented W-2 people would have. So when you voted for this anti-immigration, and voted for what's happening now, how does that affect your project moving forward if you were to have W-2 employees that demand benefits, who may unionize and have other labor rights that undocumented immigrants did not have the privilege of having? How does that affect your underwriting and your spreadsheets and such? It's interesting because a lot of people are realizing how expensive racism is. Yeah, it is. It is.
That part,
It is because
that
you
part.
voted for Trump because you're just, oh yeah, he's a real estate guy, developer guy, investment guy, finance person. But then you forgot employee base and the demographics of those people. So sure, if you want to have more American people, legalized, legal status people, then get ready to pay for that. And how does that affect your overall project across your portfolio? Yeah.
And I'm all for it. I think that there should be a way to produce more people who are undocumented to convert into being documented.
Yeah.
I think that's how it should be. It's just, again, with politics, it's the how that gets convoluted and politicized and divisive
Yeah.
instead of it being, we all know what the issue is. Let's just work together.
Yeah.
Let's just find a common goal and let's work together.
And that's exactly
And
it. And that goes back to what I was saying about public-private partnerships. Like instead of exactly what you said, instead of being reactive, being more proactive, with that oversight of everyone knew, right? Oh yeah, real estate. Like when we see a construction site, it's like, yeah, how many of those are actually documented individuals? And everyone knew. But we're seeing the consequences of, for example, city municipalities like not having the proper oversight to protect those who are undocumented. Because truly, if we were to give them a voice, we'll see how maybe like sinister things were, right? The lack of protection that you and I have the luxury and the privilege of having. They don't have that outside of not having access to being unionized and healthcare and being underpaid. If we give them a voice, then we'll definitely see how much that they were not protected. And I think that's a lot of what public sector should have stepped in and protect those people as well. So it's going to be, comes down to accountability and how do we move forward and everything starts with a conversation, right? That P3 aspect is relevant.
For sure. Well, I appreciate this conversation and this dialogue, extremely in depth. It definitely serves the larger audience and it's global. So I really love that. We're going to start ending it out with our better living interest rapid fire. We want to, I'm going to ask you these questions. You're just going to go off the top of your head, first response, and we're going to go with it. Okay.
Okay.
No overthinking. So, favorite quote or mantra?
It all seems impossible until it's done by Nelson Mandela.
Love that. Book that changed your mindset.
The Bible.
Amen. One skill everyone should master.
Emotional intelligence.
Love that too. Most slept on city for real estate development.
Detroit. I'm hearing a lot about Detroit.
It's a good city. Been there.
I've never been.
Love the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Coffee, tea, or kombucha?
Tea. Yeah.
One word your friends would use to describe you.
Resilient. There's so many others.
Love that.
One-dimensional. There we go.
Good.
That covers a lot. It's one word.
Multi-dimensional? Yeah, that is one word. Well, I appreciate you, Peyton. Where can the people get connected with you to find more insight on the work that you're doing, policies that you help shifting and changing throughout the world? How can they connect with you?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn is great. It's just my name, Payton Parkin, MS. LinkedIn is amazing.
Perfect. Yes. Well, we appreciate you. Thank you again for joining the show. Thank you for the insight. Thank you for the amazing work that you're doing in the world and the community. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, until then, we want to say peace to everybody. Continue to live better, love one another. And it's okay. You can still make $1 while still doing the good work, right?
Not mutually exclusive, that's for sure.
Amen. Well, until then, y'all, stay tuned. Please like, comment, and subscribe below. Your thoughts on the conversation that we had today. What are the innovations in the world that you're seeing, maybe in your market, in your country, in your state, in your city? Drop that comment below and check Peyton out on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Until then, keep living better. Peace.
Bye.